All right, so ready to dive into the world of FinTech API design?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. So we're really lucky today. We're breaking down this talk by Jeremy Glassenberg, and he's like a real veteran in this space, built APIs for like Box, DocuSign, and some pretty big names in FinTech too, which we'll get to.
Yeah, he's definitely been around the block.
Right. And I gotta say, I love how he tells it like it is. He doesn't sugarcoat anything. Like right off the bat, he goes after EDI, electronic data interchange, calls it ancient history, a nightmare, basically.
Well, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
EDI was, how do I put this? It was like the clunky, messy prototype for modern APIs.
Right.
Imagine like having to manually send faxes every time you needed to update your, your bank balance or something.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, that's not ideal.
Yeah, that gives you a sense of what it was like. So thankfully, things have moved on.
Yeah, thank goodness for progress, right?
Absolutely.
But it makes you wonder, how did we even get from there to, where we are now?
It's been a journey, that's for sure.
It's crazy to think that even just, 15 years ago, things still weren't exactly smooth sailing in the FinTech world?
Oh, yeah. No, definitely not.
I mean, remember those days of, sites like Mint.com having to resort to screen scraping?
Oh, yeah. That was not great.
It always made me so nervous, security-wise,
And for good reason. It was basically like sneaking in through the back door to grab data.
Right. Yeah.
Banks were understandably, very protective of their customers' data. Open APIs weren't exactly the norm back then.
Yeah, makes sense. So what changed? How did we get to where we are now?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Regulation.
Oh, okay. I see where you're going with this.
Right. The U.S. brought in open banking. Europe had PSD2. And suddenly, banks were required to, open up their data vaults.
Give customers more control over their own financial lives.
Exactly. And this paved the way for a wave of innovation in FinTech.
Yeah, because now there was this open playing field, right? Anyone could potentially build on top of this financial data.
Right. And that's what's so fascinating about these regulations is they didn't actually dictate how to design the APIs, just that they needed to exist.
Interesting. So it's here's the door, now you figure out how to build it.
Exactly. And that sparked this incredible burst of creativity.
I can imagine. So with everyone kind of figuring things out, were there any companies that really stood out in terms of API design? Who were the early leaders that set the standard?
Oh, absolutely. And Jeremy talks about this in the talk. Companies like Stripe, they came in and basically redefined the game.
Stripe, yeah. I hear so much about their APIs being the gold standard.
They really are. And it's become this common strategy. When in doubt, ask, what would Stripe do?
Wow, that's a huge compliment. So what is it about their approach that's so revolutionary?
Well, it all comes down to user experience. Even for developers, a well-designed, intuitive API can make or break a product.
That makes sense. It's even if the technology is brilliant, if it's a pain to use, nobody's going to want to use it.
Exactly. And Stripe's success is a testament to how much of a competitive advantage a great API can be.
Okay, so you've got Stripe setting the bar. Does that mean everyone's just copying them now? Is there one standard for FinTech APIs?
That's what surprised me too, actually. There isn't one strict, everybody follow this rule book.
Really? Huh. Interesting.
It's more like there are definitely some emerging best practices patterns that you see across the industry.
Okay, so what are some examples?
Well, for example, Jeremy points out that most of the major players, they use integers for currency values.
Integer. Okay, so whole numbers instead of decimals?
Right.
Why is that? You'd think a dollar is a dollar, right?
It is. But think about it this way. When you're dealing with decimals on a computer, you run into the whole rounding thing.
Oh, right. Rounding errors.
And those can cause, issues, especially when you're talking about money. So using integers, it just makes things cleaner, more precise.
Yeah, that makes sense. So less room for error.
Exactly.
So we've got this mix of innovation happening, but also, not everyone's on the same page.
Right.
So are there any companies trying to bring some order to this whole, FinTech API Wild West?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeremy actually talks about this a lot in the talk. Plaid.
Plaid. Okay, yeah, I've heard of them. They're the ones who connect all the different banks and stuff, right?
Exactly. They're in a really interesting position because they work with, pretty much everyone.
Yeah, so they see it all. So what are they doing?
So Plaid, they're basically saying, look, if you want to play in the FinTech sandbox, here's how you should be building your APIs.
Interesting. So they're kind of like setting the standard by example.
Yeah, exactly. They've published like these really comprehensive API specifications that a lot of institutions are starting to adopt.
Oh, wow. So it's actually working.
It seems to be. Which, makes sense. It benefits everyone in the long run.
Right, because then things are more standardized. Less friction, I guess.
Exactly. Smoother integrations, fewer errors, and ultimately a better experience for everyone.
Makes sense. So besides this whole standardization thing, what else stood out to you about Plaid?
Well, one thing that I found really interesting was their focus on security, especially when it comes to like those administrative tasks that fintech companies need to do.
Oh, interesting. Can you give me an example? Like, what kind of tasks are we talking about?
Sure. So think about like an app that automatically invests your spare change, right?
Okay, yeah.
They need access to your transaction data, but they shouldn't be able to see like everything in your account, right?
Right. That'd be a little creepy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do they do that?
Yeah, how do they do that?
Well, there are a couple of ways to approach it. Yeah. One is to use a single like administrative token that has really broad permissions.
Oh, okay.
And then they just try to control access internally, within their own system.
Huh. That sounds a little, I don't know, risky. Like, if that one token gets compromised, they're in trouble.
Right, exactly. So Plaid, they advocate for a different approach.
Okay, what's that?
Using more granular, like user-level access tokens, even for those behind-the-scenes operations.
Oh, interesting. So instead of having like one master key that unlocks every door, they're using like a key card system where each card only lets you into specific areas.
Exactly. It's a little more work up front, but it adds this extra layer of security.
Yeah, and I'm guessing it makes it easier for these companies to comply with all those like financial regulations.
Exactly. It's like baking security into the foundation of the system rather than trying to add it on as an afterthought.
Smart. Yeah, like building a fortress, but instead of one big wall, they've got checkpoints everywhere.
Exactly. And that actually leads into another really important aspect of API design in FinTech, authentication.
Oh, right. Authentication, making sure the right people are accessing the right data.
Yeah, exactly. And Jeremy talks about how, like, Oath, it's considered the gold standard, right?
Right.
But it's not always the perfect fit for every situation in FinTech.
Yeah. Really? Huh. I thought Oath was, like, the go-to for securing APIs.
It is, for sure, in a lot of cases. Like, think about when you use your bank's app to, authorize a payment in another app.
Okay, yeah.
That's probably using Oath behind the scenes. It's great for those, like, client-side interactions.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So where does it kind of fall short in FinTech then?
So a lot of integrations in FinTech, they happen, like, server to server, behind the scenes, basically.
Right.
And in those cases, that whole, like, authorization flow that Oath uses, it's not always necessary.
Yeah, I guess it could even be kind of a pain, right? If it's just between systems, you don't need all that back and forth.
Exactly. So something simpler, like just using basic authentication with API keys, can actually be more efficient.
Oh, okay. So it's like choosing the right tool for the job, right? Not just assuming one size fits all.
Exactly. It all comes down to, like, what level of security do you really need for this particular interaction?
Right. And finding that balance between being secure but not making things overly complicated.
Exactly.
Man, this has been like a masterclass in FinTech API design. I feel like I've learned so much.
It's a fascinating space for sure.
It is. But okay, so for anyone listening who might be thinking, this is all cool, but I'm not building the next Stripe or Plaid.
Right.
Why does this even matter?
Because even just understanding these trends at a high level, it gives you such an advantage.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, imagine you're evaluating different FinTech solutions.
Right.
Knowing about things like idempotency or, the pros and cons of different authentication methods, it allows you to ask smarter questions. You can cut through the marketing jargon and figure out if a company is, like, truly prioritizing security.
Yeah.
Or if they're just, slapping things together.
Oh, that's such a good point. It's like having that, like, insider knowledge. You can see past the surface and understand how things actually work.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. Right.
Totally. Okay, so to kind of wrap things up here, what are the big takeaways from our deep dive into FinTech API design?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is just how far the industry has come, right? From those, like, EDI nightmares to these sleek, user-friendly APIs.
Totally. And we've seen that regulation, while sometimes it can feel like a roadblock, it can actually push innovation forward.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we've seen how companies like Stripe and Plaid, they're really setting the standard for the future of FinTech.
Yeah, through these like smart, secure APIs that actually put the user first.
Yeah.
It's kind of inspiring when you think about it. Makes you wonder what other industries could benefit from this kind of approach.
Right. It's a good question.
Like what seemingly complicated systems are just begging for someone to come in and make them more accessible, more user-friendly through good API design.
It's something to think about, for sure.
It is. All right, well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.